From a linguistic viewpoint, the history of Papiamento is quite clear. As you might be familiar with, there are a lot of theories like monogenetical theory, polygenetical theory, there is bioprogram theory. But lately, the latest work that has been done on the origin of Papiamento keeps quite clear that the origin of Papiamento is already back in Africa. So it was once the slave ships left Africa after 1650 to go to Curacao. Papiamento was probably already creolized. Before, for many years, we thought it was pidgin, an Afro-Portuguese pidgin that came with the slave ships. But today, due to a recent study on protomorphology that was published in 2012, it's quite clear that it had a high deal of creolization already when it came from Africa. So the beginning is very clear. The islands have been discovered before by the Spaniards in 1499. Then the Dutch took over in 1634 under Johann von Walbeck because they thought it would be strategically clever. But linguistically, this first period when the autochthonous language, the Caquetillo language, which is an Arawak language, met with the Spanish, didn't have a lot of impact on Papiamento. It is kind of a substrate for what Papiamento later on is. So the history of Papiamento actually starts in the mid-17th century. The first Dutch settlers come after 1650, and then the Sephardic Jews arrive after 1660, and that's about the period that the first slave ships arrive. Most of the slaves didn't stay on Curacao, but they went on to other islands. Curacao is there's very little water there. It's very rough soil, so they couldn't do much about it. And it's the same thing for Aruba and the same thing for Bonaire. Both islands were discovered a little later. So most of the history that takes place is centered on Curacao and then passes on the other islands. Okay. So all the islands had some kind of indigenous substrate. Then the Dutch settlers coming in, the Sephardic settlers coming in, and the African slaves coming in. It's about 20% of the vocabulary from Papiamento stems from Dutch.
Okay.
And that is basically due to the Dutch colonial power that was already in place when the Creole, the Proto-Creole or Creole arrived on the islands. The interesting thing is that the Dutch gave basically words that were important in administration or for the crafts. So there are lots of Dutch words for objects already very well established. Like when you sit on a chair, you would call it a stool. So it's the same word that we have in German. Or when you say thank you in Papiamento, it's always danke. So it comes from danke, from Dutch. Then you have a lot of words in modern administration that are also stemming from Dutch, like bestuurscollege, like all the highly difficult administrative terms. So the whole colonial history did not do any harm to Papiamento. Papiamento was even taught at schools already in the 19th century by the different congregations. The Dutch never impaired the passing of Papiamento to the next generation, because the interesting thing is, why is it spoken by all classes and from the very beginning on? The crucial point is already the mid-17th century. When the slaves arrived, the social elite of the island was formed by Dutch people on the one hand and Sephardic Jews on the other hand. And these two groups, they couldn't talk to each other because one of them spoke Dutch and the other one spoke Portuguese at the time. So in order to have a lingua franca, a common language, they picked up the Papiamento already brought in by the slaves. So from the very beginning, from the 17th century onwards, it was the language of everybody. From the highest class to the lowest class, everybody spoke Papiamento. And this is very unique amongst Creole cultures. It's the only place that, to my knowledge, where this happened.
Okay.
So the Dutch colonial power didn't interfere at all until the construction of the large refineries. Mm-hmm. So Aruba has a large refinery that was built in the early 20th century, and Curacao has one. When the refineries were built, a lot of migration took place, and the population of the island grew extremely. In Curacao, it was like from 30,000 people in the beginning of the 20th century up to 150,000 people at the end of the century. And this growth was basically due to different groups coming in. For example, Portuguese people from Madeira, or it was a lot of Dutch people coming in. And to have the Dutch engineers interested into the island group, they offered them that they would be able to come with their families, and the Dutch system would be introduced into the schools on Curacao. So after 1918, Dutch became obligatory for schooling. And after that date, until about the late 70s, there was a phase where Papiamento was oppressed in the schools. So the kids were not allowed to speak Papiamento, not even during the breaks. They were punished if they spoke Papiamento. So it changed completely in the 20th century. But before the 20th century, there was no oppression of Papiamento at all. Okay. To add something about Spanish and Portuguese that you were mentioning, in that early phase, Spanish were quite close. So there are many words in Papiamento where you can't say this is from Portuguese and this is from Spanish, because just take the word papear. Papear is an onomatopoetic word that came into Portuguese first and then passed on to Spanish, but in Old Spanish and Old Portuguese it's almost the same word, so there's not a difference. Okay. So it's very hard to say this word comes from Portuguese and this word comes from Spanish. Because in the older stages of languages, they were very much alike. In many scientific writings, you find people talking about relaxification, so that Papiamento was relaxified from Portuguese to Spanish. I think there's a very strong Spanish influence starting in the 19th century already. So at a point where the lexicon of Papiamento not quite expanded yet. So when lexical expansion starts and Papiamento is entering more and more social domains and more complex domains where you need like language for a specific purpose, Spanish is the main language to borrow from. And it remains the main language to borrow from until today. So when I write in Papiamento and I don't have a term for something, I always look up how is the term in Spanish first, and then I try to make up a word, and then I discuss it with the colleagues, and then we find a solution. But it's mostly borrowing from Spanish. But I wouldn't say that it's a Hispanization, so that we replace a lot of words, but we make new words using Spanish, because Papiamento is a fairly young language, so it emerged from 1650 to 1750, so it doesn't have that long history that other languages have, so you still need a lot of vocabulary. So I wouldn't say that there is any type of decreolization at the moment, not at all. But what there is expansion, basically grounded on borrowing from Spanish. This was, I said, until the late 70s, because in the late 60s you have very important riots. Some of the 68 spirit also swept over to the islands. And people were very unhappy about the situation. So what happened was they burned half of Willemstad during the riots, and then something like an Antillianization took place. So a lot of teachers were replaced who originally came from Holland. Like the name for the teacher in the classroom is also a Dutch name. It's juffrouw. A young woman, juffrouw. And the juffrouw didn't understand a word of Papiamento. So she was teaching in Dutch, and the kids had to somehow keep going in a way, and they didn't, of course, because this is what we call a homeschool mismatch. What they heard at home and the concepts that they learned at home were not learned at school. And I remember seeing these kids still in the early 90s. They could read a whole page of Dutch very well, but they wouldn't know what it said. So there was no connection between the concept and what they read, because Dutch is not playing any kind of role in their lives outside school. The whole day is Papiamento, is only Papiamento, the whole media and Papiamento. Okay. And the only thing they did was like being forced to speak Dutch at school. So in the late 70s, the first laws were made to introduce Papiamento to schools, and it took a long time until this happened. To my knowledge, in 87, they started teaching Papiamento as a subject matter, and then in 2004, they started teaching, using it as a language of education. So not only as a subject matter, but as the real language of education, but only in primary schools. Then we call it is a traditional phase, then they pass on to Dutch. But this caused a lot of troubles. So the Protestant schools were kind of overwhelmed. They had an acceptable rule. They could keep teaching in Dutch. So lots of people wanted to put their children in the Protestant schools. So they liberated it again, a little bit, the law. And today, I recently had a student working on the topic. You find all types of schools, bilingual schools, schools teaching only in Papiamento. We went to see one of them. It's called the SKY, Escola Avançada Integrada. So there are all types of schools integrating Papiamento and Dutch somehow in their curriculum.
Okay, that's awesome. And in particular, are there any subtle difference in the Papiamento spoken on the different islands? I mean, between Aruba, between Bonaire, between the other one, Curaçao?
Yes.
Well,
I just had a colleague over from Curaçao last autumn, and she was teaching my Papiamento, and she's born on Bonaire, then she lived on Aruba, and then on Curaçao. So she knows all the three varieties.
Okay.
And she can say precisely if somebody comes from one of the islands. And if you live there after a while, you also start hearing it. So Aruba has a little more Spanish words because of the strong Spanish presence. The words in Curaçao, a little more Dutch words. In Bonaire, it's very few people. It's only 15,000 people. Papiamento is a little more English influenced, I would say, in terms of borrowings. But there's also a difference in terms of tone, prosody, the way people pronounce. I find Arubian Papiamento a little more melodic, so people are singing when they speak. So sometimes when you hear it, you can spot them and say, this is Aruban Papiamento.
Oh, okay.
So there are differences, and there are lots of differences in terms of words as well. So this is why they had in the 90s a so-called Interinsular Commission for the Standardization of Papiamento. And when you look up words in the dictionaries, many times you have like restrictions, like this word is only used on Aruba, or that word is used only on Curaçao. Oh, okay. So for very simple words like strawberry, you can say fresa, you can say strawberry, and you can say arte, and the preferences are according to the islands, and also sometimes according to the type of fruit. So you have a lot of borrowings from different languages, but it also makes the language rich.
Sure.
And it's different on every island, a little different. Yeah. Perfect. I mean, every country you go on Creole languages, people talk also about Papiamento.
It's a Creole language then, and well, obviously then there is no.
It is because it comes originally from a pidgin, and the Creole group as a group of languages, they all stem from a pidgin language in the beginning. And the origin of Papiamento is when Afro-Portuguese pidgin emerged on the African coast or in West African mainlands. So this is also, you can see, because if you speak Papiamento and you go to places like Guinea-Bissau or you go to Cabo Verde, you can talk to everybody in Papiamento and everybody understands. So the origin is quite clear. It's very close to other Creole languages. The vocabulary, the morphology is very close to other Creole languages. If you say, for example, the word papia, or the word ai, mitapai, papia, no stapai. So you have a lot of words that are quite similar than in other Creole languages.
Okay. So that would be something.
Or the nang, the African marker for the plural. Yeah, you say one book, buki, and you say buki nang, books. I wouldn't see it changing so much. Not the basics of the language. Of course, the words, new words coming in, and you're asking yourself, there are a lot of English terms coming into Papiamento. Yeah, a lot of words are adopted from English, as in many other languages of world. So you just adopt the new terminology for computers and for anything. You just take it in from English, because basically all the people who live on the 3 islands, they all speak 4 languages. Yeah, most of the people there. I mean, there are exceptions always, but they all speak Papiamento. They speak Spanish, they speak Dutch, and they speak English. So even 3-year-old kids have these 4 languages, and they just, when they don't know a term in one of them, they just adopt it from the other language. So I think the 2 main entrance doors for Papiamento's new vocabulary is Spanish and English. So they adopt a lot of words, but that's kind of a logical process. And I would say the next generation will have different topics and different words they need. When they translated the Bible into Papiamento, they had to look up words or make up words for old profession and things that are not there anymore in the world. And they also had to find a solution in Papiamento, how to call certain things. I think all the 3 islands and Aruba as well, they have a Caribbean identity. They belong to this area of the world and they feel as a Caribbean. So there's a certain sense of Caribbeanness amongst the people. I think they also do that because it's a feel-good identity. It's not a negative identity. It's not connected to items, and it makes them feel part of a larger part of the world. Because if you live on a little island, it's always hard because you're very limited in space. So the interconnectedness is very important for these people, I think, and that's through a certain Caribbean identity. Yeah, I don't think that it's a purely geographic notion. It's also a notion. What is Caribbeanness? Yeah, it's a certain way of social creolization. So we're all kind of cultures merged together, all kind of racial backgrounds merged together, all kind of languages merged together. For me, Caribbeanness is in one place a kind of fusion, a social fusion. With all the ingredients that I just mentioned. On the second hand, it's also an inclination for multilingualism. All the people in the Caribbean are multilingual. I'm a single person who speaks just one language. It's like it belongs to them. They're very proud. They speak 3, 4, 5 languages. How does national identity and language relate to each other in Aruba? I think on all of the islands, Papiamento is crucial for their identity because, okay, they share Spanish with the South American, Middle American continent. They share English with parts of the Caribbean. They share Dutch with the former motherland, or still the motherland, because they're still connected politically. But what makes them Aruban is papiamento. So it's a very important thing for them. And this is also, Aruba actually adopted papiamento as an official language earlier than Curacao. Aruba did it in 2003 because there were a lot of disparities between the languages in the 70s, which also led to the two different ways of writing papiamento, which is until today a big problem. We're currently working on it to reunite the two orthographies, but it's a hard piece of work, not only on linguistic grounds, but on political grounds, to find that the people will have to work together again. Because for the book market in papiamento, having two ways of writing papiamento is a big problem. But the origin of this problem is that in the 70s, all the islands were kind of striving for their own identity, their own way of being, and they didn't want to be dependent on each other anymore. So when Aruba left the group of six in the early 80s to gain a status aparte within the Dutch kingdom, it was because of political reasons, because Curaçao was bigger and economically more important, and they wanted to detach and say, we're different, we identity. It's not about Netherlands and Antilles anymore. We're different. So, and they kind of also placed that issue into linguistic grounds and said, and this is why we write differently. Okay. And they do write papiamento in a certain different way with etymological constraints in a way. Papiamento in Curaçao and Bonaire is written according to phonological rules. So the rules are, you write as you speak. There's always one letter for one sound. And the way you write Aruban papiamento is the origin of the word. So when the word comes from Spanish, you have to use C instead of K when you write it. When it comes from Dutch, you use the K for the same sound. So one is slightly etymological, the other one is highly phonological. So now we're trying to reunite the orthographies to make papiamento stronger. And I found that people are very much connected to their way of writing it as well. How deep is the remaining Dutch influence, okay, on the national identity, if there is a sense of belonging to the Kingdom of the Netherlands? Yes, there is, to a certain extent, because of historical roots. So people kind of feel connected still to the Netherlands. The places are to the Wilhelmina, the queens and the kings of the kingdom. When the king comes, they're very proud of it. So kind of they also feel that Europeanness or that European background, and some of them are kind of proud still of like having this Dutch background. So it is a little portion. There's a little bit of it in their identity, but it's not dominant. I mean, you always have to think of the amount of money the kingdom put into the islands. I mean, this is cost them a lot of money. They gained when they had the West Indian Company, but now it's the other way around. So it's basically Holland paying for the islands. And sometimes they were always asking them, do you want to be independent? Do you want to be them to say yes, but they said no in the end. I mean, Bonaire even moved closer.
Yeah, we read
about
it.
With the dissolution of the Netherlands and Antilles in 2010, I lately wrote an article. It's called Divide et Impera. You part and then you reign. So now they're in completely different constellations, political constellations. So it's very hard to keep the language together. Bonaire is a community of Holland, so they're under European law. Aruba has a status aparte, which is different from the status aparte from Curaçao. So everybody has their own laws. I think the language is quite emblematic. This is what makes them distinct, makes them special, and I think they feel it very strong. And that has changed in the past 20 years to a growing extent. When I first went there in the early 90s, when you were like talking Papiamento as a foreigner to somebody, they would stop you immediately and pass to Spanish or English or French or any other language. But it should never be Papiamento. So they had the typical attitude is like, this is connected to slavery and this language is not worthy and this language doesn't have the same value than other languages. It's completely different today. I think when I went there with my students, I just went to Curacao with 13 of my students, and they had the Papiamento before. And then everybody, of course, in the beginning, before we met anthropologists, sociologists, linguists, people, all kind of people on the island, migrants from all different groups. And the first thing they were always asking, like, which language do I speak to you? Do you want me to speak Spanish or English or Dutch or Papiamento?
That's nice.
And students always said Papiamento. And they were like, oh my God, yeah, this is beautiful, yeah. And then everybody understood, and sometimes in the discussions, of course, when it got more complicated, we switched into other languages. But basically, all the presentations and everything, very high level, also scientific level, was done in Papiamento. So I think there is a big change to the better, so that this language actually means a lot to them, and they do a lot for it to have it like an emblematic symbol for their culture and their identity.
Okay.
And they're proud of it, which wasn't the case, like not as much the case years ago. I had a hard time finding people who wanted to speak it with me. So I had like to study at home all by myself, and then later when I got better, I could ask like people in the street, and they would always change into another language. Never do that today. They would just say, oh, it's great that you speak Papiamento, and keep going. Yeah, so they wouldn't see any reason why they should change to another language. Because there's a big change attitude also towards the smaller languages. So people see more value. I think it's really good what they do in terms of educación bilingüe intercultural. So what actually was created in Peru and then passed on to Ecuador, to many other places.
Yeah.
And I just had a course we finished last week on El Español en América, and we were talking basically about language contact with indigenous languages. And there's I see there's a lot of different countries where people give more value to their own languages, that the language is taught at school,
That's true.
that it has a value, that it's part of me and it's part of my culture.